All right. So we have Manvel with us today, founder and managing partner of InterlinkLaw. How are you today, Manvel?
Doing well, thank you.
So how were your travels? Did you get here safe, quick?
I got here safely, but it wasn't quick.
So let's get started. What can you tell me about InterlinkLaw?
InterlinkLaw is a boutique immigration law firm. We handle employment-based and investor-type visas and green cards. And we also work and really focus on green cards and visas that don't require an employer or a family member in the US. So these green cards and visas are available to people who have achievements that elevate them above the others, and US government is interested in inviting those people to live in the US, and we help them get there.
All right. So what's the name of this visa?
Well, there are a few types. At the end, everybody gets either a green card. There are different types of green cards, but it's still a green card and gives you the ability to live permanently in the US. And there are different types of visas. There is the O1 visa, for example, for people with high achievements. There are also visas for investors, for those people who want to start a business in the US, like an E2 visa. These are the main categories we work with.
Okay. Can you tell me more about the achievement visa? How easy it is to get it? Who qualifies?
It's not very easy. No visas are easy in the US, but it's possible to get them. And these visas are issued to people who have a track record of excellence, let's say. They normally are very successful in either arts or sports or business. There is really no limit to the field of endeavor, but they have to be at the top of their field to qualify.
Okay. And how does Interlink help the qualified artists or qualified people to reach their visa?
Well, there are many criteria that they have to meet, and to document those achievements is another story, right? Somebody could be very successful but not very good at documenting those things and not very good at presenting them to the immigration service in the US. And that's what we do. We help people document their achievements, really expand on their work and show it to the government.
Okay, that sounds great. So with the recent geopolitical changes, have there been any changes in immigration processes? Are Russians applying more to your services? Can you give me a brief story about that?
Well, there are changes all the time. Immigration law is very fluid, and there are many changes. That's why it's so complex. Since the beginning, there was no one big reform that would change everything. Changes are incremental and they are layered over each other. That's what brings complexity to the immigration law. Recently, there have been many changes. They don't only affect Russians, they affect everyone. And some of them are positive, some of them make the process more difficult with the COVID and all the restrictions. We've seen, processing times increase significantly. A lot of people have problems scheduling their appointments at the embassies because of the unavailability of the time slots for visa interviews and so on. But there have been very positive changes as well. For example, many green card categories that we work with, the petitions, once you file with the immigration service, they take a long time to process. And the US government, the immigration service, implemented premium processing recently for categories that were not eligible for premium processing. What that means is that you don't have to wait months to have a decision from the immigration service, it only takes 15 or 45 days sometimes. Yeah.
So we have a list of FAQs here. One of them is how long does it take, the whole process, immigration process? I guess it depends.
It depends, and there are no strictly defined timeframes for any of those processes. What we have is averages, and there is a formula that the immigration service uses to calculate the average processing times, but they vary within the same visa category. More or less you can expect several months or sometimes more than a year to process a petition, but if there is premium processing service available, then the process would take either 15 or 45 days depending on the visa category and green card category that you're applying to. There is a way to expedite the process.
So can you give me a step-by-step in this process? Maybe how InterlinkLaw involves, where it starts, what's the first step, what's the last step?
Well, the first step is always gathering the information, right? We need information to determine which green card or visa anyone is eligible for. And that's really important because half of the success is in determining eligibility and looking at whether an applicant meets the criteria. And that's what we do very carefully. We assess all the information we're given, and we look at green card and visa categories and determine whether or not that application would be successful. And then the next step is really to document the eligibility. So if we're talking about visas for people with extraordinary ability or outstanding ability, then we look at their achievements, we look at their track record. If these are artists, we look at what shows or performances they've been part of. We look at whether they have any awards, whether they played a role, significant role within any organization that is very well known. And then we build a case that is then presented to the immigration service. Same with sports. We look at look at competitions, titles, and so on, and we try to really show the achievement of the applicants.
And what are the common mistakes people make when applying for these green cards, when they're applying alone by themselves?
Well, the biggest mistake is probably treating these applications as something formal. In many countries, and I've worked in my previous career with outbound immigration, where we help our clients get visas to other countries, European countries mostly, and the difference is really striking in that where in Europe sometimes you go through a checklist and you submit documents and that's enough. In the US, the government, the immigration service really looks to the substance, and they evaluate the material, the documents that are provided to them, not superficially. They look deep into the information that's provided. And so the biggest mistake is to treat this process as formal and say, I submitted documents that seem to meet the criteria, but they're not substantive sometimes, or there is not enough information. And so then what happens is the immigration service would either deny that petition, or they would send a very long request for evidence saying you're missing this, and that. And what that does, even if you're successful responding to those requests, it would take a lot of additional time to process.
And that's where Interlink comes in and makes everything smoother and easier.
That's our job, yes.
What's interesting here is that you say Interlink has a pay-as-you-win model. Can you explain a bit more about that?
Well, there are many different ways to charge clients, right, that law firms use. Most lawyers in the US work on an hourly fee basis, which means they count the hours that they work, and then they bill their clients at a certain rate. In immigration law, mostly in the US, it's flat fee-based model where a client knows from the start what the fee is going to be. It doesn't change based on the hours that the lawyer spends. However, most law firms charge substantial amount as a retainer fee, meaning a client would pay that sum upfront, and then the rest is paid when the documents are either submitted to the immigration service or sometimes when they're approved, but mostly when they're submitted to the immigration service. So what that does is the really, the interests of the client and the lawyer are misaligned in a certain respect, and we try to bring them more into alignment. So what we do is we charge very little in the beginning of the process, and we delay most of the legal fee until the moment that the petition is approved.
So what are the best ways to immigrate to the US as an Indian citizen? What's the best and the fastest way?
Well, Indian citizens have always, have historically faced a lot of difficulties immigrating, not because they're ineligible, but because the waiting times for Indian nationals are substantially longer. There is a per-country quota for green cards, for example, and for India has always been what's called oversubscribed. That means that even if you're eligible, even if your green card petition is approved, as an Indian citizen, you would have to wait many years before you can actually immigrate to the US. And so there are green card categories that haven't been subject to this limitation. So EB1, for example, category, which is reserved for people with extraordinary ability, this category hasn't been backlogged in that way, and so for Indian citizens, it's really worth it to look into that and to see if they may be eligible for EB1 green cards.
So what makes someone eligible for EB1?
They would have to show that they are at the top of their field, that that either they received a very significant award, and the Immigration Service gives an example of a Nobel Prize, or a lesser award, and then some, okay? So really, if you look at scientists, artists, people who are very good at sports, businessmen as well, you would have to show that they've achieved recognition as being at the top of their field, either nationally or internationally.
Mm-hmm. Do PhDs count as eligible for EB1 visas, or they are in different categories? And how can students doing their PhD in the US per se stay there and become a green card holder or a citizen in the long run?
A PhD is always a plus when applying for an EB1 green card. It doesn't automatically mean that you qualify if you have a doctor's degree. However, it means that you've achieved a high level of training in your field, and most PhDs have publications in scientific journals that are peer-reviewed and so on and cited, and this is what Immigration Service is looking to see. The difficulty with PhDs is that they work while they get their PhD or while they're a student doesn't really count. So post-PhD is where the achievements are accumulated most of the time.
Okay, and I guess the same goes for a master's degree.
Yeah, master's degree, PhD is not the requirement. And, we worked with people who don't have PhDs, but they have, many publications, for example, in scientific journals that are cited widely by other scientists, and this qualifies. Also, we would need to look at what is it that they've done in their field. Maybe they don't have a PhD, but they do important research and they've discovered something, and that counts. So I'll give you an example. I was present during a conversation not that long ago, and this person was applying for a visitor visa to the US, and I started asking a few questions. We started talking, and it turns out this person was a boxing champion.
Oh, really?
He had titles that he won in Armenia and regionally, and from what he said, he'd be eligible for a green card without an employer, without having to go through labor certification and so on. And he didn't know about that.
So is that common to be eligible for a green card? If you're good at what you do, you're most likely eligible.
They're very good at what they do, but they're not very good at immigration law. Neither should they be, right?
That's where you come.
So they don't know. But we know, and we tell them when we see that somebody is eligible, yes.
So with people who have a tourist visa to the US, what are the ways to turn that into a permanent residency instead of just tourist? Are there ways, or it's mainly they need to search for a job? What can a, let's say, Indian citizen or a citizen of the world do if they have a tourist visa and want to stay there permanently?
Well, it's possible to convert or change status from non-immigrant to immigrant, right? So from tourist visa to a green card. While in the US there is a process for that, and it's handled by the immigration service. So whoever is using this route doesn't really need to go to an embassy to get their green card. However, there is always the possibility that somebody misrepresented their intentions while entering the country as a tourist, and we have to be careful about that. And I have to advise that shouldn't be done. However, things happen. Tourists are admitted to the US for a long period of time, normally for 6 months, and people's intentions change during that time. Things develop. Sometimes opportunities come up, and of course they would be eligible in that case to ask for a change of status. And if it's a green card, then we file an application to adjust status in the US. The US government takes that application. If the person is eligible, they would go through a background check process, so they would be invited to submit their biometric data at some point, fingerprints and so on. They would have to go through a medical exam to show that they don't have diseases that prevent them from getting green cards. And then the government processes this paperwork, and if it's successful, then they get their green cards without having to leave the United States.
Usually, how long does this process take?
It would probably take more than a year at this point, looking at the current processing times, but these change. So, when we are asked about how long something is going to take, it's a very uncertain answer, because we look at processing times that exist now, but down the road they could get longer, or the government could speed up and get everything approved faster.
And what are the requirements of obtaining, let's say, a work visa in the US? Can you apply for work while you're there as?
You can, if you have an employer. Most work visas require an employer in the US. And so if you happen to have found an employer who is willing to sponsor you for a work visa, for example, H-1B or O-1 visa, you could apply while in the US, and you could ask for a change of status from one non-immigrant category, which is tourist, to a work visa category.
And earlier you said something about investing, and you can invest your way to a green card or a citizenship. Can you elaborate more on that?
Well, there are different investment programs. When we talk about investment, people normally think about the $1 million investment, which is called EB5 green card category. And these are, of course, they work, but there are investments that don't require as much money. They don't give you a green card right away, but they give a lot of people the ability to live in the US and work. The time that people are given on those visas vary based on nationality, because these visas are governed by bilateral treaties between the United States and any particular country. So some countries are eligible, some are not, and some can get visas for 5 years, others a bit less. But normally what happens is those who are eligible, they would start a business in the US, right? That's the goal. And so these applications are processed via the embassies. We typically don't file anything with the immigration service in the US, but we prepare an application packet for the embassy. You need a business idea. You need to show that you have money to develop that business, that you're willing to invest substantial amount, but that amount is not governed by any law, right? So it has to match to your business idea and to the business plan that you're providing to the embassy.
Okay, so what steps should an entrepreneur take when he has a boutique startup who's doing well, who has potential? What are the steps that this entrepreneur should take, and how does Interlink come in and help this business move to the US?
Yeah. So we look at the business plan, we look at finances, we look at the ability of the investor to document that the money they're going to invest in the US are derived from a legitimate source. And we help them develop the evidence to meet the criteria, the visa criteria, right? Because in business world is a little bit different from what the government requires sometimes. And some of those laws were written, most of them before the new economy, before remote work, before all of those things. So we need to look at the business idea. We need to look at the business plan and see if it meets the criteria, and if it doesn't, then the investor has the ability to adjust their plan so that it does meet the requirements of the immigration law.
And what about the people who are in process of the immigration, have applied for their papers, are waiting for an answer, and they have families abroad? Can they bring in their families, or what's the process for that?
Well, most visa categories and green card categories allow for the immediate family members to either join or follow or apply simultaneously with the investor or, a visa applicant. And so spouses and children under 21 would get their visas and green cards at the same time as the principal applicant, or they can follow to join if they remain abroad while the principal applicant is in the US processing their paperwork. As soon as that application is approved, the family can join them and if it's a green card, they also get green cards. If it's a visa, work visa, for example, they get a special visa for family members.
For an artist living abroad, let's say Armenia, Russia, India, what are the steps this artist should take in order to immigrate to the US?
They should really look into the things that they've done.
How so?
Exhibitions, awards. We look at whether they've been commercially successful, because some artists really are. Every artist thinks that they're the best and the greatest, and we tend to agree with them. But it all requires documents, right? So we have to look at, we have to go through probably years of their work and really, really document what they've done and how much impact it had, their work had. And so that's the main thing that they should do in the beginning.
Do local accomplishments or prizes count, or these accomplishments should be international?
They don't have to be international. Somebody could be very well known on a national level. And it's particularly important for small countries like Armenia. Because for these artists, for example, it's still difficult to obtain or attain national recognition, but sometimes it's easier than if you live in Russia or in India, where there are millions of people and you compete with millions of artists, probably, right? So there are opportunities for artists from small countries because they qualify, right?
And does the same qualification process go for athletes in these countries, male or female athletes?
Yes, exactly. We have to show that they've achieved excellent results, that they're at the top of their field, either nationally or internationally. Those who are in competitive sports, for example, they often participate in competitions that bring in athletes from different countries. And even if that competition took place in their own country, it still counts as an international competition. And if they won that competition, then they have international recognition. Yeah.
Oh, that's interesting. So athletes do not need to find a team in the US in order to go there. In case, if an artist has won medals and trophies within their country, they do not have to wait for a team abroad, a team in the US to sponsor them in order to go.
They don't have to. It happens often, but for EB1 category, for example, that's not the requirement. The only requirement is that they have to intend to continue to work in their field of endeavor. And most of them do, right? Yeah. Because if you're very successful at what you're doing, you will keep doing that in the US. And so that's all that's required.
All right. So what's the difference between EB1 and EB2 visas?
EB1 is probably the most difficult category to work with, because you do have to show extraordinary achievements. EB2 category is reserved for someone who has qualifications that are high, but doesn't necessarily require extraordinary ability. So EB2 category, for example, if you have advanced degree, if you have a master's degree, for example, and you have several years of experience, you may qualify for an EB2 green card. Most of those green cards do require an employer in the US, but there are some that don't. If your work is of national importance to the US, then the job offer and the process of labor certification, which we haven't talked about today, but it's a separate process that involves Department of Labor in proving that that particular employer cannot find candidates in the US who are qualified to do the job. If your work is of national importance to the US, then all those things are not necessary, and you could still qualify even if you don't have an employer.
So can you clarify a bit more about labor certification? How often do you find that in your field?
Very often, because we're often contacted by employers who have employees who are foreign nationals and work for them pursuant to a particular work visa, right? H-1B, O-1, and so on. And if that employer wants to retain those employees permanently in the US, then they would have to sponsor them for green cards, because most visas have a cap. So on H-1B visa, for example, which is very popular among professionals in the US, you could only have that status for 6 years, and then you have to depart the US. So before that time runs out, employers often find it necessary to sponsor them for a green card. And that process requires a test of labor market. So they would post that position, and there are specific guidelines how this should be done. And the point of that is to prove that they've tried to find qualified workers in the US and they were not successful. And in that case, they are able to file the green card petition for that particular employee. The Department of Labor is the agency that determines whether or not they've been successful in their efforts to recruit US workers. So that's called labor certification.
All right, interesting. So whenever this employee gets his green card, can he sponsor his spouse or his fiancé?
Yes, most of the time, right? So spouses typically obtain their green cards at the same time as the principal applicant. Same for children. And once they get their green cards, if they get married, there is another way to bring their spouses to the US as well.
Okay, and does this apply to parents or siblings?
It doesn't, unfortunately. Green card holders are not able to sponsor their parents or siblings, but once they become US citizens, they can.
What are the ways someone can sponsor their wife or, let's say, their sibling whenever they're a US citizen? Do they need to go to a lawyer per se?
Well, not necessarily, but most people do go to a lawyer, and these services, legal services, are very expensive. We work, in fact, on a legal tech startup that helps people apply for family-based green cards. So for spouses, parents, siblings, children, so on, without having to retain a lawyer. And what that does is significantly reduces the cost of the process. It's an app, right, that we're developing, and the app follows certain logic that lawyers typically follow to go through the eligibility criteria and to prepare the paperwork that needs to be filed with the Immigration Service. It's all done automatically. Applicants go through a questionnaire. They answer questions that are simple to understand, and the app works to create the paperwork that they need to file.
What's the name of the startup?
It's called AmpiChop.
Okay, so final question. How can, let's say, an artist or a professional or a green card holder reach out to you? What's your website? What are the steps they should take? Should they gather their paperwork and then apply? Or what do you advise?
I would advise them to contact us first so we can help and guide that process. A lot of people are qualified for different visa categories, but they don't know about it. And so that's another big issue, right? To determine whether or not you qualify for any particular kind of visa or green card and what that category is. And that's where we come in. So I would advise them to contact us. We have a website, it's InterlinkLaw.com. They can submit a query or request a consultation, and we would take over and help them gather the information, determine what they're eligible for, and go through the process.
Okay, so you help even though the applicant doesn't know exactly which visa he should apply to, he just wants to go to the US, he or she just wants to immigrate to the US. You guide them and tell them this is the visa you can apply to, you're eligible for this.
Yes, we do that. We ask many questions, and based, as we should, And based on the answers, we determine whether or not they're eligible for any particular visa category.
Okay, that sounds great. So thank you for your time.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Hopefully, we'll speak again soon.
Looking forward to it.
Okay.